All right, tonight's class is on Federalist Paper 24. Now, the Federalist papers are written in, like some of them will have 3 volumes that go together covering the same subject, and some of them are just individual. A lot of it was put together by how much argument they were getting back from the Anti-Federalists and what some of the complaints were. If you remember in Federalist 1, Hamilton said we would go through that, and anybody that had a legitimate concern or complaint, that we would answer those questions and they would be very candid about it. Of course, you're not going to answer every complaint, because there's going to be some people that are going to complain. Like my dad, when I was growing up, he'd say, "You'd complain if you was hung with a new rope." Mm-hmm, sure would. But there's some people just going to complain about anything, right? And so they knew that they couldn't answer every complaint that was going to come in, but those that had merit to it, and those that were backed by the loudest voices and the most amount of people, they were going to give credence to and actually argue that. Now, if you remember in England, when we studied English history, during the English Civil War, the religious wars that were going on, the people were very mistrustful of the king having a standing army for more than 1 year after a conflict. Because what happens is all executives need to war, and all armies need to go to war to pay for the army. Why do you think we're trying to go to Ukraine? And we got people like McConnell and Ryan and Lindsay and all those morons telling us that we need to go kill more people somewhere and send stuff there and start World War III and then send our own young there to die, which is ridiculous. This is a imperialistic ideology. It is not a conservative ideology, and it's not supported by the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. So all of that we are entertaining right now is completely unlawful and unjust and immoral, absolutely immoral. So Federalist 24, there was a lot of people that were worried about the general defense of the nation and what was going to go on. You had a lot of anti-federalists who were angry because the founding fathers didn't have a provision in there for no standing army. And that bothered a lot of the anti-federalists, because the anti-federalists were worried that if the federal government had a military, that sooner or later it would be used against the states. So Madison and Hamilton both tried to calm their fears a little bit in explaining that in the Constitution it says the ability to raise an army, not to maintain, but with a navy, the verbiage says to maintain a navy. And the reason why is because it's much harder to sail a ship into Kansas to usurp the rights of the people than it is to march a ground force in. So, but they also understood that they were a fledgling nation and they did need some type of security, and that's usually done by people that are paid to wield a gun. So even though we were going to maintain a navy, all the naval yards and where they store the ammunition and all that stuff, and the ports needed to be secured, forts, ports, and armories. And so Madison explained how they needed to have at least a small force, because it would be impracticable, especially on the Western Front, because we had a natural security to the east, because we had the Atlantic Ocean. And as long as we had a navy there, we were good, but we didn't so much have as much security to the west. And so they knew that if they were to put outposts out into the western lands as security for the border there, it's tough to take a militia and rotate people through there all the time. It takes people away from their family, it takes them out of the economy, and it's not good. So that they knew they had to have a certain amount of a standing force. Now, not this huge, super military industrial complex like what we have now, but they knew that they needed to have somewhat of a small standing army just for continuity and for security, but not this huge standing army. So this was an argument. So Federalist 24 is takes up where part of that argument is, and Hamilton wrote this one, and explaining to the Federalists these arguments that they're having about the security in the forces for the federal government. The powers necessary to the common defense further considered. Now, if you remember, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 ends with, for the general welfare and common defense, right? Now, when we get into the bounty payments for cod fisheries debate of 1792, and also one of the other, in the Federalist Papers, you're going to see where Hamilton argues that the common defense and general welfare clause does not give any additional power to the limited enumerated powers of the federal government. It defines what those powers do. Later on, in 1792, when he became the Treasury Secretary, he actually argued that they should be able to collect taxes and pay grants to pick and choose who should win in industry under the general welfare clause. So our founding fathers, I want you to understand, they're not deists, they're not deities. They were not gods, they were human beings. And they were fallible like all human beings, and we all are. And even today, even the best people that you would put into place are going to, from time to time, do some bad things, because we all have the propensity for good and evil in us. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And good people do evil things with the best of intentions. It happened to our founding fathers, it's going to happen to us today. Who's going to think not? If those people were that great and we hold them at such high esteem, what makes us think that that same problem isn't going to happen today? So we have to understand, when we study this history, we have to understand it in the context of today, because the human condition has not changed. It is the same. So we have to look at these things and understand what is good and what they did that violated those principles or violated those tenets, and what kind of trouble it got us into. By understanding that history is what's going to keep us from doing the same mistakes going forward. That's why this is so important. So the title of this is The Powers Necessary to the Common Defense Further Considered. Federalist number 24. It was published 19 December 1787, Hamilton, for the Independent Journal. It was posted in the Independent Journal. And they all start out, to the people of the state of New York. To the powers proposed to be conferred upon the federal government in respect to the creation and direction of the national forces, I have met with but one specific objection, which, if I understand it right, is this: that the proper provision has not been made against the existence of standing armies in times of peace, an objection which I shall now endeavor to show rests on weak and unsubstantiated foundations. Now, where did the Anti-Federalists get this idea? During the reign of King Charles. Do you think they didn't know their history? This is why in England the king could not have a standing army, because the king abused it every time the king had a standing army. If they didn't have a war to fight, if they didn't have a tract of land to take from someone else, the army got turned against their own people every time. It has indeed been brought forward in the most vague and general form, supported only by bold assertions, without the appearance of argument, without even the sanction of theoretical opinions, in contradiction to the practice of other free nations and to the general sense of America as expressed in most of the existing constitutions. He's talking about the constitutions in the states. The proprietary of this remark will appear the moment it is recollected that the objection under consideration turns upon a supposed necessity of restraining the legislative authority of the nation. Now remember, they said the legislature, because it's the biggest and most powerful arm of the government, would probably be the most susceptible to usurpation of all, to usurping all of the other powers and becoming tyrannical. So restraining the legislative authority of the nation in the article of military establishments, a principle unheard of except in one or two of our state constitutions and rejected in all of the rest. A stranger to our politics who was to read our newspapers at the present juncture without having previously inspected the plan reported by the convention would be naturally led to one or two conclusions. Now he's talking about the general person that would just be reading these arguments in the newspaper. Either that it contained a positive injunction that standing armies should be kept up in time of peace, or that it vested the executive the whole power of levying troops without subjecting his discretion in any shape to the control of the legislature. Now remember, in England, the king was the executive, and he had sole control of the army. So they understood this separation of powers, and what does separate mean? They're separate. So they don't have to abide by the other branch. And the reason why that's important is because before we can go to war, we have to have a vote of war. The Congress must vote for an act of war before the president becomes commander-in-chief and can assemble an army and send it somewhere. That's why all of Bush's wars were illegal, and that's why all the wars we've had that we call police actions since World War II have been unlawful wars. If he came afterwards to pursue the plan itself, he would be surprised to discover that neither the one nor the other was the case. That the whole power of raising armies was lodged in the legislature, not in the executive. That this legislature was to be a popular body consisting of the representatives of the people periodically elected. And that instead of the provision he had supposed in favor of standing armies, there was to be found in respect to this object an important qualification even of the legislative discretion, and that clause which forbids the appropriation of money for the support of an army for any longer period than 2 years, a precaution which, upon a nearer view of it, will appear to be a great and real security against the keeping up of troops without evident necessity. So what's he saying there? The only time they could steal money from you to fight a war was for 2 years. You know why 2 years? Because if you remember, the legislative body is the largest and most powerful branch of government. And because of such, they only gave them a 2-year term so that they would be the most responsive to the people, right? So if your congressman voted for an act of war, and that war started going south and looking real bad because you weren't told all the information, all you needed to do was remove the bum at the next election. That's why they could only appropriate the money for 2 years. When the new Congress came in, they had to vote again. Makes sense, doesn't it? That keeps us from being in these long-standing, fruitless wars with absolutely no end date. Can you say Afghanistan and Iraq? That would have prevented that. But we didn't do it right. George Bush went to the United Nations to get authority to bomb countries that did nothing to us, not Congress. Disappointed in his first surmise, the person I have supposed would be apt to pursue his conjectures a little further. He would naturally say to himself, it is impossible that all this vehement and pathetic declamation can be without some colorable pretext. It must needs be that this people, so jealous of their liberties, have, in all preceding models of the constitutions which they have established, inserted the most precise and rigid precautions on this point, the omission of which, in the new plan, has given birth to all this apprehension and clamor. So what he's saying is, this person that's reading it's going to say, well, why are they arguing this so vehemently? Well, it must be in the other state constitutions, these provisions. And that's why the people are apprehensive of it. And this is what's brought about this great convulsion in argument. If under this impression he proceeded to pass and review the several state constitutions, how great would be his disappointment to find that two only of them contained an interdiction of standing armies in the time of peace. Only two. That the other 11 had either observed a profound silence on the subject or had in express terms admitted the right of the legislature to authorize their existence. Okay, so think about that. The right of the legislature. So they were on the right track. But what he's saying is this person that would be reading and looking at this argument, he must suppose that these provisions were in the state constitutions. That's why it's such a national argument. But yet it's not. So Hamilton's doing a real good job of cutting their feet right out from underneath them on this argument, showing that it's a fruitless argument, that it's gaslighting, which is what we love to do in politics. Still, however, he would be persuaded that there must be some plausible foundation for the cry raised on this head. He would never be able to imagine, while any source of information remained unexplored, that it was nothing more than an experiment upon the public credulity, dictated either by a deliberate intention to deceive or by the overflowing of a zeal too intemperate to be ingenious. Basically, he called them gaslighters. It would probably occur to him that he would be likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. Here, at length, he would expect to meet with a solution of the enigma. No doubt, he would observe to himself, the existing confederation must contain the most explicit provisions against military establishments in time of peace. And a departure from this model in a favorite point has occasioned the discontent which appears to influence these political champions. If he should now apply himself to a careful and critical survey of the Articles of Confederation, his astonishment would not only be increased, but would acquire a mixture of indignation at the unexpected discovery that these articles, instead of containing the prohibition he looked for, and though they had, with jealous circumspection, restricted the authority of the state legislatures in this particular, had not imposed a single restraint on that of the United States. If he had happened to be a man of quick sensibility or ardent temper, he could now no longer refrain from regarding these clamors as the dishonest artifices of a sinister and unprincipled opposition to a plan which ought at least to receive a fair and candid examination from all sincere lovers of their country. Whew, that's scathing. He set them up, showed what they were gaslighting, and he took them down. He wrote this very well. I wish we had statesmen of that quality today. How else, and I'm not a big fan of Hamilton, but that was excellent. We need more statesmen like that. How else, he would say, could the authors of them have been tempted to vent such loud censures upon that plan about a point in which it seems to have conformed itself to the general sense of America as declared in its different forms of government, and in which it has even superadded a new and powerful guard unknown to any of them? If, on the contrary, he happened to be a man of calm and dispassionate feelings, he would indulge a sigh for the frailty of human nature, and would lament that in a matter so interesting to the happiness of millions, the true merits of the question should be perplexed and entangled by expedients so unfriendly to an impartial and right determination. Even such a man could hardly forbear remarking that a conduct of this kind has too much the appearance of an intention to mislead the people by alarming their passions rather than to convince them by arguments addressed to their understandings. See, they didn't have a ministry of misinformation then. Think about that. Hamilton knew that these people were putting out misinformation to scare the people. This is why the freedom of speech is so important. I don't want somebody to keep misinformation from me. I want to hear both sides of the story and make my own mind up critically. Because then and only then do we have good, sound decision making. So these ideologies of these ministries of misinformation, that the government needs to do that happens in socialist dictatorships. Do you understand that? That's how socialism takes over, by deciding what gets out out to the people and tells the people what to believe. Thank God we didn't have that then. Hamilton was able to take the fears that they were trying to seed among the people, and with reason and good logic, speak to the people. Speak to the other side of that. So we can either depend on our constitutions by accident and force, or through deliberation and choice. And only does the First Amendment allow us to deliberate and then choose. And that's what's going on right here. Did I finish that one? I did, didn't I? But however, little this objection may be countenanced, even by precedents among ourselves, it may be satisfactory to take a near view of its intrinsic merits. From a close examination, it will appear that restraints upon the direction of the legislature in respect to military establishments in time of peace would be improper to be imposed, and if imposed, from the necessities of society, would be unlikely to be observed. So again, they're going back to understanding the natural nature of man, not calling it good or bad, but understanding how it works and putting safeguards in its place. Now again, Madison will say in a couple different places in here, it's not perfect, and yes, there are risks to this, but we've done everything we can to minimize the risk because liberty is unsafe. Get over it, Karen. Okay? Though a wide ocean separates the United States from Europe, yet there are various considerations that warn us against an excess of confidence or security. On one side of us, and stretching far into our rear, are growing settlements subject to the dominion of Britain. On the other side, and extending to meet the British settlements, are colonies and establishments subject to the domain of Spain. This situation and the vicinity of the West India Islands belonging to these two powers create between them, in respect to their American possessions and in relation to us, a common interest. The savage tribes on our western frontier ought to be regarded as our natural enemies. They're natural allies because they have most to fear from us and most to hope from them. So they're natural allies to Britain, Spain, and France. And most to hope from them. The improvements in the art of navigation have, as to the facility of communication, rendered distant nations in great measure neighbors. So the world was getting smaller even then. Britain and Spain are among the principal maritime powers of Europe. A future concert of views between these nations ought not be regarded as improbable. So what do we got going on right now? We wanted to keep Russia and China from coming together, didn't we? Because that would be bad for the whole world, not just us. And what are we doing? We've got a moron sitting in the White House pushing us to World War III and causing those two to come together in concert. It's not good to play with nature. It's not good to try to be the world's police force, is it? So they were worried about that with Spain and Britain as well. The increasing remoteness of consanguinity is every day diminishing the force of the family compact between France and Spain. The politicians have ever, with great reason, considered the ties of blood as feeble and precarious links of political connection. These circumstances combined, admonish us not to be too sanguine in considering ourselves as entirely out of the reach of danger. Now you have to remember, in medieval Europe, you had arranged marriages. And they did this so that there was blood connection to keep the countries from going to war with one another. Hamilton's saying those practices are starting to go by the wayside, and they've been so many generations back that you can't depend on those ties. Those two countries can become enemies or friends. And they can either come together against America, or America is going to have to go together with one of them for its defense. So we can't just sit by idly and go, whew, we want a war, we're a country, yay us. Doesn't work like that. Previous to the Revolution and ever since the peace, there has been a constant necessity for keeping small garrisons on our western frontier. No person can doubt that these will continue to be indispensable, if it should only be against the ravages and depredations of the Indians. These garrisons must either be furnished by occasional detachments from the militia or by permanent corps in the pay of the government. The first is impracticable, and if practicable, would be pernicious. The militia would not long, if at all, submit to be dragged from their occupations and families to perform that most disagreeable duty in times of profound peace. We have the same problem right now with our National Guard and our Army Reserves, don't we? Yes. That's why it's important to have someone paid permanent as that, a permanent duty station. And if they could be prevailed upon or compelled to do it, the increased expense of a frequent rotation of service and the loss of labor and disconcertion of the industrious pursuits of individuals would form conclusive objections to the scheme. It would be as burdensome and injurious to the public as ruinous to private citizens. The latter resource of permanent corps in the pay of the government amounts to a standing army in time of peace. A small one, indeed, but not the less real for being small. Here is a simple view of the subject that shows us at once the impropriety of a constitutional interdiction of such establishments and the necessity of leaving the matter to the discretion and prudence of the legislature. Excellent point. In proportion to our increase in strength, it is probable, nay, it may be said certain, that Britain and Spain would augment their military establishments in our neighborhood. If we should not be willing to be exposed in a naked and defenseless condition to their insults and encroachments, we should find it expedient to increase our frontier garrisons in some ratio to the force by which our western settlements might be annoyed. So he's saying whatever the threat level is, our defense level must meet that. To have too little defense is bad. To have too much defense becomes aggression. There are and will be particular posts, the possession of which will include the command of large districts of territory and facilitate future invasions of the remainder. It may be added that some of those posts will be keys to the trade with the Indian nations. Can any man think it would be wise to leave such posts in a situation to be at any instant seized by one or the other of two neighboring and formidable powers? To act this part would be to desert all the usual maxims of prudence and policy. If we mean to be a commercial people, or even to be secure on our Atlantic side, we must endeavor, as soon as possible, to have a navy. To this purpose, there must be dockyards and arsenals, and for the defense of these, fortifications, and probably garrisons. When a nation has become so powerful by sea that it can protect its dockyards by its fleets, this supersedes the necessity of garrisons for that purpose. So he's saying we're not big enough yet. We can't set it up like some of these other nations, these seafaring nations do, because they've been built up for a while. So their navy can defend their own coast and dockyards. but ours can't. We're not that big yet. But where naval establishments are in their infancy, moderate garrisons will, in all likelihood, be found an indispensable security against descents for the destruction of the arsenals and dockyards, and sometimes of the fleet itself. Publius. Now, were we worried about agents operating within the United States against